I'm Richard Stallman, founder of the free software movement and lead developer of the GNU operating system, which is typically used together with the kernel Linux in the combination GNU plus Linux. I started using free software when I went to work at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT in 1971. I joined a community of hackers who were the people who had developed the operating system that the lab used. And that system was free software. All the software we used at that time in the lab was free, meaning that everyone was welcome to have copies of it and share it and change it and use it in whatever way it was useful to them. I learned what it was like to live in a free software community by living in one, by using and adding to free software, because I was a system hacker. That was my job, to improve the system that everybody in the lab used. So I was studying and improving these free programs. A hacker is someone who enjoys playful cleverness. Not necessarily with computers, but computers are a very good medium for playful cleverness because you can build things that will build other things. It can be tremendous fun. You can make things that are useful, but in doing so, you can be clever. So if you're inclined to enjoy being playfully clever, programming and computers in general give you lots of opportunities to do so. But hacking is not limited to working with computers. And if you look in stallman.org/photos/hacks, you'll find photos of some of my hacks. And the only thing that they had to do with computers was that I took a photo of them. And you can also look at stallman.org/articles/on-hacking.html for what I have to say about the concept of hacking. Now, occasionally, one thing hackers would do was cleverly break the security on computers. At the beginning, they did this because they wanted to use the computer and nobody was using it, say, at night. Some administrator who was more concerned with control than with getting anything useful done would lock it up and it would be going to waste, and students would have things they wanted to do on it, but they had to get through this stupid, harmful security in order to do anything. So they figure out ways to do so, and it was fun. But this is just one thing some hackers occasionally did. However, when the mainstream media found out about hackers around 1981 or so, they latched on to that one small aspect and misused the word hacker as if it meant that and only that. But at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, nobody ever broke security, ever, because we had none, on principle. You see, this was a lab where the operating system was written by hackers. So we never had to break any security. We controlled all the software. We just made sure it had no security, so we never needed to break any. I don't know if they came only out of there. After all, I only joined it in 1971, and I didn't personally experience its history before then. I think free software existed in the 1950s. As soon as there were several computers of the same model and different people using them to do different things, it was natural for them to share code, and I believe they did so at that time, but I don't know any details. However, in 1970, the operating systems delivered by Digital Equipment Corporation for its computers were free software. The users got the source code. They were welcome to change it. There were no copyright notices on that code, meaning it was in the public domain. That's what the law in the US was at the time. So in fact, it was free software. But during the 1970s, gradually free software disappeared everywhere except in our lab. And then our community died in 1982. You can read about it in the last chapter of the book Hackers by Steve Levy. But essentially, the people in the lab, some of the hackers, designed a computer called the Lisp machine, which was meant for running programs in the Lisp language, which is a very powerful, the most powerful programming language, and frequently used for artificial intelligence. Well, this computer was designed to run Lisp programs much faster than other computers would. And of course, it needed an operating system, which was written in Lisp by the hackers, including parts of it me. And then MIT made it proprietary software, and did so as part of a deal with two different companies, both founded by hackers from the lab, to manufacture Lisp machines. And because they were competing, they started to fight each other over the effectively devastated lab, because almost all the hackers had left to go to these companies. And one of these companies sought outside investors and then tried to hire away all the hackers it could, except for me, because most of the people didn't like me and they knew that I would never say yes to them anyway. So there I was, the last hacker at the AI lab. So with only me left there, it was impossible to continue the culture that we had had. It died. The AI lab ceased to be a special, exciting place because it ceased to have a culture dominated by hackers. And the administrators took over and put on the kinds of rules that existed everywhere else, and too bad, there goes the neighborhood once the administrators move in. So worse than that, though, these two companies were fighting each other, and particularly the one that was well-funded and had most of the hackers broke essentially a deal, a gentleman's agreement, to share the changes that they made in the operating system with MIT, which meant that that company effectively gave everyone in the lab an ultimatum. We were forced to choose a side, either for them or against them. Well, there's only one thing to do when that happens: you're against them. You got to punish them for forcing you to choose a side. Because if you go along with them, you become their tool against someone who's innocent. So I punished them for 2 years. For 2 years, whenever they made an improvement in the system, I wrote an equivalent improvement starting from scratch. I didn't see their code. I wrote their improvement. And once I had written all the major things, then I looked through their code changes to look for minor, tiny bugs they had fixed. And then I'd fix them a different way. So I was being very careful not to do this illegally. But the point is, I was defeating their aim, which was to make everybody go to their side and destroy their competitor, which had not given us an ultimatum. So I did this for 2 years, but as I was midway through the second year, I saw that soon it would not be possible to continue. They had developed a new model of machine which required different software, and I wasn't interested in maintaining software for their products. So I saw that my rearguard action would have to come to an end. I also saw it had succeeded. They had been unable to destroy their competitor. They hoped that this would destroy that competitor, but they had failed to do so. But also, at the same time, I didn't want to spend the rest of my life punishing the assassin of our community. I wanted to build a new free software community. So I thought about how to do this. I realized that you can't have a free software community without a free operating system. So I decided to develop a free operating system for modern computers. The one we had been using through the 70s, well, that was for a computer that had become obsolete, the PDP-10. So it was no use continuing with that. I would have to write something else, something more modern in its design. So that's what I decided to do. I decided to make a system similar to Unix. Unix was a rather modern system with some technical advances, and people admired it, and a lot of people used it. So I would make a system compatible with Unix, that is, with the same commands, the same system calls. If you had written a program to run on Unix, it would run on my system also. That was the aim. But my system would consist entirely of free, that is, freedom-respecting software, so the users of the system would be able to use it in freedom. That was the advance I sought. Not a mere technical advance, but an ethical advance. So that would require writing every piece of the system afresh. It would be illegal to use code from Unix, so we wouldn't do so. And I gave the system a name following the custom. The custom of the day in the hacker community was when you wrote a program similar to some existing program, one way of giving credit was to use a name which was a recursive acronym saying this program is not the other one. For instance, I wrote the first extensible Emacs text editor in 1976. And there were many imitations of Emacs after that. And some were called thus and so Emacs. But one was called Fine, for Fine is not Emacs. And there was Sign, for Sign is not Emacs. And Eine, for Eine is not Emacs. And Mince, for Mince is not complete Emacs. That was a partial imitation, a stripped down version. Didn't have the extensibility, but it had the same commands. So they recognized it was just a partial imitation. And version 2 of Eine was called Zwei, for Zwei was Eine initially. So we had a lot of fun with recursive acronyms. My system is called GNU, which stands for GNU's, not Unix. If someone asks you, what's GNU? You can answer GNU's not Unix, and it sounds like you're obnoxiously telling a person what it isn't instead of what it is, but in fact you're giving the right answer. So you can have lots of fun with it, but the reason it's so funny is that according to the dictionary, that word GNU is pronounced new or new, so it's a pun, and that's why people use it in lots of wordplay. But when it's the name of our system, it's pronounced GNU. Never pronounce it new. You'll confuse people. Our system is not new anymore. Freedom is essential for an ethical society. An ethical society respects people's freedom. It's organized so people have freedom. But with non-free software, the users don't have freedom. They're under the control of someone else. There are just two possibilities if you're using software. Either the users control the program or the program controls the users. Free software is the first case where the users control the program. In order to have control over the program, users need certain freedoms. And so those freedoms are the criterion for whether a program is free software. Always remember, it's free as in freedom, not as in price. So think of free speech, not free beer, if you want to understand the term free software. It's clearer in French or Spanish, because there we have the word libre or libre, which means free only in the sense of freedom and doesn't refer to price. In English, unfortunately, we have no such word. So we have to use the word free, and we have to say it's free as in freedom. But if the users don't have enough freedom to have control over the program, then the program controls the users. And there's always somebody who has control over the program, which means that that program is an instrument for his power over the users. So a non-free program is an instrument to subjugate people with. It's evil. It should not exist at all because it always abuses people. And that is a social problem we should get rid of. And that's what I'm aiming to do. Now, when I announced this plan in 1983, my goal was simply to make a free operating system so it would be possible to use a computer without ceding your freedom to a non-free program. But the ultimate goal is bigger. It's the liberation of cyberspace. All users deserve to control their computing and not be under the control of somebody else. To explain why a non-free program controls the users, I've got to explain the 4 essential freedoms that define free software. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so the program does your computing the way you wish. When a programmer writes a program, it's written in a programming language and it looks somewhat like algebra. It's in a kind of language that you could understand if you've learned it. If you've learned how to program and you learn that language, then the source code makes sense to you. It's a bunch of rules and equations that say what computing to do. In order to run this, it's usually converted into a bunch of numbers, and those are called an executable program. And even a programmer can't make any sense out of those. Actually, it's possible in principle. It's called reverse engineering, and it's terribly hard. So it's something you do as a desperate last resort. And you expect it to be a big job always. So freedom 1, the freedom to study and change the source code, presumes that the source code's available to you. Because if you don't have the source code, that sabotages any possibility you have to study what that program really does and change it to do what you want. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help others. That's the freedom to make exact copies of the program and redistribute them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community. That's the freedom to make copies of your modified versions and distribute them to others when you wish. So what it amounts to is users control the program both individually and collectively in any groups they choose to form. They don't have to be explicit organized groups. Any people who happen to have the same desires are likely to end up cooperating and realizing those desires with the program. So how does a non-free program deny your freedom? How does it mistreat people? It takes away these 4 freedoms. So the users don't control what the program does. They can't change it. So it does whatever the owner decided, and the users are stuck with that. And in some cases, the program won't even let you run it the way you wish. There is a proprietary program for managing websites whose license says that the users are forbidden to use it to publish anything that criticizes the developer of the program. I say think of free speech, not free beer, but in this case, the proprietary program literally attacks users' freedom of speech. The proprietary software in the iPhone and the iPad and the other iThings attacks freedom of speech also, because the users can only install programs approved by Apple, and Apple practices very strict and arbitrary censorship. And this is bringing me to another way that many non-free programs attack users' freedom. I won't say all because I don't know, and in general we can't find out. But many non-free programs have explicit malicious features. I'm not talking about errors. These features are no accident. They were deliberately programmed to hurt or mistreat the users. There are 3 kinds of malicious features that I know of. There are malicious features to spy on the user, surveillance features, that is. There are digital handcuffs, features to restrict the users, also known as DRM, Digital Restrictions Management. And there are backdoors, features that can receive commands from others to do things to the user, things that might not be very nice. Now, these are quite common. In fact, most people who use non-free software are using malicious non-free software. One example is Microsoft Windows. It has all three kinds of malicious feature. And I'm talking about specific features that are documented. It's established. I'm not speculating here. And one of them is a universal backdoor. This means that Microsoft can remotely install software changes, meaning that any malicious feature which Windows doesn't have today could be forcibly installed tomorrow. In other words, Windows is malware. The iThings software is malware also. It has surveillance features, digital handcuffs. Apple is a pioneer in tightening the digital handcuffs more than ever, and a backdoor that's also known. Now, even one malicious feature is enough to make the program malware, but these cases have all three. Then there's the Amazon swindle, which forces users to identify themselves. So Amazon has a giant database that lists all the books that the users of the swindle have obtained. You can't buy a book anonymously by paying cash. Well, that's not ethical, to force people to identify themselves.
And what they're reading.
Exactly. And then there are also digital handcuffs. The purpose of digital handcuffs is to stop you from giving a book to someone else after you've read it. With a paper book, you could give it to someone else. You could give it to me, or I could give one to you, but that's impossible with the swindle. And then you can't even lend the book regularly to other people, and you also can't sell it to a used bookstore. And there's a back door as well. The back door can do various things. We don't know all the things it can do because we haven't been able to see the source code. What we know is it can be used to remotely delete books. We know this because in 2009, Amazon remotely deleted thousands of copies of a particular book. Until that day, those were authorized copies. People had obtained them directly from Amazon. The book with which Amazon demonstrated how Orwellian its product is was 1984 by George Orwell. Most cellular phones have spyware programs explicitly installed which can send on remote command all sorts of information about what the phone is doing. And many of them can be remotely converted into listening devices. So some software has bugs. This software is a bug. So these are the most commonly used non-free programs. Oh, there's also Flash Player, which has a surveillance feature and digital handcuffs. So almost everyone who's using non-free software is using one of these, which means malicious features. So what this means is once the owner has power over the users, if that owner is a psychopath, I mean, for instance, a corporation, what's it going to do? It's going to abuse that power in every way that seems advantageous. The point is, nobody should have that kind of power over anyone else through our software. And the only way to prevent it is insist on free software. I should first explain that I announced the GNU project in September 1983. I started actually working on it in January 1984, and that's when I resigned from my job at MIT. I started the Free Software Foundation in October 1985, so that came substantially later. Now, once I resigned from MIT, I had the question of how I would make some money. I didn't need money to live on because, fortunately, unemployment is not deadly. for the most part in this country. However, I wanted to be able to buy some things. I didn't need a lot of money because I always continued living a student lifestyle. I rejected getting addicted to expensive habits because I knew that would make me the slave of money and thus the slave of whoever was prepared to pay. Therefore, I felt a revulsion towards any expensive habit. I wanted to keep my freedom. I didn't want to have to be desperate to make money to the point where I couldn't say no to something I felt was wrong or would mistreat me. That made the job much easier. In any case, in 1985, I had an actual piece of the GNU system which was ready to distribute and would be interesting to people to run on top of Unix. See, most of the pieces of GNU were replacements for some piece of Unix, and people who had Unix already had that piece, so they didn't need our replacement for it. I didn't think they'd care. But I wrote a program, namely GNU Emacs, another extensible editor, which didn't exist as a normal part of Unix. So I figured lots of people running Unix would want to get GNU Emacs to run it on top of Unix. So of course I put a copy in an internet server at the lab because they let me keep using the lab's facilities even though I had quit. So I put it there for people to download. But in 1985, even many programmers didn't have an internet connection. So I began selling copies on magnetic tapes for $150. And here you see it's crucial that it's free as in freedom. It doesn't mean gratis. It doesn't mean that a copy should never be sold. On the contrary, anyone can make copies and sell them. That's part of freedom number 2, the freedom to make copies and distribute them to others. You can give them away or you can sell them as you choose. So I chose to do both in parallel. I gave away copies through the internet because you could download a copy without paying me. But I also sold copies, and a substantial number of people bought copies. I got 8 to 10 orders a month. And I could have lived on that if necessary. But in October '85, I started the Free Software Foundation because at that point I figured now that we had GNU Emacs, people would be able to see that GNU was more than just talk, that GNU would have real software that would be interesting. So I figured someone, perhaps a hardware manufacturer, might want to donate money to do more work. Therefore, I needed a tax-exempt organization they could donate to, and I started one. And once the FSF was going, I figured it was natural that the FSF would sell the magnetic tapes. So it began to do so. And I also wrote a manual for GNU Emacs, which was also free as in freedom. And the FSF began selling copies. And this is how it got most of its money back in the 80s. Nowadays, it's mostly donations and members' dues. Back then, we didn't have members, so most of the income came from sales. Anyone can be a member of the Free Software Foundation if she would like to support our work. You can join through fsf.org, FSF for Free Software Foundation. Once the FSF took over selling copies, I changed to doing something else, namely free software consulting. People would pay me to make improvements in free software. I charged a lot of money for that, and I discovered that I could make a living in 7 weeks of paid work per year. That gave me all the money I wanted to spend, and I was no longer economizing quite so much, plus an equal amount to save, because I'm not like most foolish Americans who go into debt, plus an equal amount for taxes. And at that point I figured, why take any more paid work during the year? I'll devote myself to what really needs to be done, which was pushing towards completion of the GNU system. I continued that until 1990. That's when I received the MacArthur Fellowship, and I didn't need to work at all for pay for 5 years. But I kept on living cheaply, so I saved a lot of that. And after that, I was well known enough that I've been able to get my income almost entirely from speaking since then. I started the development of the GNU system, but that doesn't mean I wrote it all myself. I wanted it to get done sooner, so I recruited people to write various parts of it. In the early days, I personally talked with people, anyone I knew who seemed sympathetic, asking him to write a piece of GNU. Also, the Free Software Foundation, once it had enough money, hired a few people to write or improve various pieces of GNU. However, as things went on, we developed the GNU Volunteer Coordinators, which is a group of people who suggest projects to people. If you want to help, you talk to them, and they'll suggest to you various things that you might want to work on. We also have a high priority projects list, basically the things we're imploring people to work on because they're really needed. In general, people who work on free software development have motives. But those motives are not necessarily incentives, because an incentive implies an extrinsic motivation, and that ignores a large part of the truth. Let me tell you the motives I can remember for why people work on free software. First of all, there is the desire to establish a free world, to liberate cyberspace. For me and for many others, that's an important motive. It's not the only one, and not everybody shares that motive. Another motive that I think just about everyone shares is fun. Programming is lots of fun. Look at how much time people spend doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku, which is an artificial challenge. Well, programming is a much more interesting challenge, and it's different every time. And not only that, it's a challenge, the solution of which is going to do some good for people. So if you've got a talent for programming, you probably love doing it. And you'll probably love it even more when you can do it as you wish on the project you chose. Another motivation is to be admired and appreciated. If you write a useful free program, a lot of people will appreciate your work. It feels good. Another motive is to get a professional reputation as a good programmer. If you have released a good free program, that shows you could do a good job. That's stronger proof than anything else you could show people. Another motive is gratitude. If you've been using free software for years and getting a lot of benefit from it, then when you write something that's generally useful, you could release that as free software as a way of paying it forward. Another motive is hatred of Microsoft. Now, I think it's a mistake to single out Microsoft because Microsoft is just one of many software developers that disrespect the user's freedom and that are treating the users in a nasty, unethical way. Singling out Microsoft often has the byproduct that people disregard the wrong of the others, and that's a mistake. It's not enough for a program not to be from Microsoft. It has to respect our freedom. That's what really matters. Another motive is to make a program more useful for yourself. If you use a free program and you realize you wish it had a certain feature, you can write that feature. And then you'll find it more useful, and so perhaps will many other people. Another motive is money, because a substantial number of people are paid to improve free software. Those 8 motives are the ones I know of. There might be others that I never heard of or forgot, and it's quite common for people to have multiple motives for doing a particular thing. Human nature is not simple. Yet you will find people who profess a simplistic theory of human nature. Humans do things when they're paid. Well, they don't know much about humans. What are my motives for working on free software? Or
yeah,
what were my motives for writing free software? Well, political idealism, fun, and being appreciated and admired, and occasionally money, and occasionally making a program better for me to use. I didn't need to have much gratitude because, after all, I'd contributed more free software than anybody else. So, although I did appreciate what others did, but I didn't feel I needed to write free software to thank them. And I didn't single out Microsoft. In fact, Microsoft had nothing to do with it at the beginning. Microsoft in 1983 made a toy operating system for toy computers, and I hardly paid any attention to it. And let's see, I wasn't exactly looking for a professional reputation as a good programmer because I already had one. Free software is a psychosocial resource. It's useful knowledge embodied in a usable form, which is available to all of society. Free software is part of human knowledge. Proprietary software has been withheld from human knowledge. I had to think a bit because I used that term in my speeches in the 90s. When I give speeches, there are always so many things I want to say that I can't fit them all. So there are parts that I've dropped out because I concluded it wasn't necessary to say them. And that I dropped out a long time ago. The most important thing we need to do to strengthen the free software movement is to make more people aware of the issue of freedom. And that requires effort. It doesn't do itself. Sad to say, there is a corporate-friendly co-optation of our work that uses the term, quote, open source, unquote. During the 1990s, in the free software community, which was already pretty strong, there were 2 political views, 2 camps. There was the free software movement, those of us who demanded freedom and were developing the software needed so we could have freedom, although we had other motives as well. And there were those who rejected this ethical position and appreciated free software for other reasons, practical reasons. And many of them did use free software, and some contributed to free software, but they didn't agree with us that freedom requires free software. They wouldn't join us in saying that a non-free program is unethical conduct, that you mustn't ever do that. So there was a debate between these camps. Of course, I'm not saying everybody agreed with one camp or the other. There were people who had various views around them and people who had never thought about the question. But these were the 2 clearly visible camps. In 1998, though, the people in the other camp adopted the term, quote, open source, unquote, which hadn't been used before for anything. And with their new term, they had the chance to decide which ideas to associate it with and which ideas to leave out. So they decided to completely omit the ethical level of the question. which for us in the free software movement is the most important thing. That's what they left out. So their discourse is based on different values. For us, the values are freedom and community. For them, the values are powerful, reliable, efficient software. So they say that they recommend a development methodology. So I'll try that again. So they say they recommend a development methodology. They say that if you let users change and redistribute the software, they'll make the code better. Well, that may be true, and if so, it's a nice bonus. But freedom is far more important than that. I'm willing to settle for poorer quality code if I get freedom thereby. So, because they are more numerous and have the support of most businesses and most of the mainstream media, we in the free software movement have to work very hard since 1998 just for anyone to know that we exist. In fact, most of the time, if anyone mentions our work or us, it's called open source, and our ideas are completely hidden. Not only that, most users of the GNU system don't know it's the GNU system because they tend to refer to it as, quote, Linux, unquote. And when it's called that, people suppose that it was started in 1991 by Mr. Torvalds, which is not the case. In the system as we use it, there is a program which is called Linux. It's one component of the system. That component was started in 1991 by Mr. Torvalds as proprietary software. In 1992, he made it free software. And this component filled the last gap in the GNU system, which was mostly complete, but it was missing one important piece. His program Linux, once it became free, filled that gap. So the system we have is basically GNU with Linux added. So it's the GNU plus Linux system, if you want to be fair. I don't have a definition for community. Okay. I'd say it's more or less a bunch of people who in some way live together. Okay. Not in immediate proximity, but in some sort of relationship to each other. Therefore, I won't use the word community to refer to an industry. That's not a community. That's treating corporations as if they were persons. I believe that all works that are meant for use to do practical jobs must be free, with the same four freedoms. Because freedom is having control of your own life. And if you use a work to do jobs in your life, to have control over your life, you need to have control over the work. But the users need to have control collectively as well as individually. So you've got to be free not only to change the work and use it the way you wish, but also to distribute copies, to publish your modified version. Your version may be useful for others. However, once people are allowed to publish modified versions, it's absurd to stop them from republishing without changes. That would just make them make some changes that don't really affect anything as an excuse. So we've got to allow the same four freedoms. That's how far the ideas of free software extend to other things. However, there are other kinds of works, such as essays of opinion and artistic or entertainment works. I do not say that those must all be free. However, we must be free to share them. By sharing, I mean non-commercial redistribution of exact copies. So the freedom to share is more limited than freedom to in the definition of a free work. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies. That includes selling them and other commercial redistribution. But when I say a work can be shared, I only refer to non-commercial redistribution of exact copies. So that is the freedom I believe we must have for all published works. It is intolerable tyranny to deny the freedom to share. And because with computers sharing is now easy as well as good, people will share. Only cruel, draconian, nasty measures can possibly stop people from sharing. So, of course, they come out with one draconian, nasty measure after another. And we've seen a couple of them recently. The US, a few months ago, established an unofficial regime of punishing people with disconnection from their ISP if they are accused of sharing. And by making this unofficial, it's only done by the ISPs. As a result, since it's not a law, the basic principles of justice have been outflanked and made irrelevant. However, if we want human rights in the internet, we must make it such that nobody's service can be disconnected without a trial. Not exactly. I'm not saying that every ISP should be required to give you a contract, but rather, once you have a contract, the ISP should not be allowed to cut you off as long as you keep paying your bill. There are starting to be free textbooks as well. Educational works are works for doing a practical job, namely learning or teaching. So they must be free. If you write any educational works, please release them under a free license. There is a strong movement now called open educational resources. And alas, because it doesn't talk about free and freedom, it frequently misses in a way that's as good as a mile. A lot of these so-called open resources are released under licenses that are not free. MIT led the way with, quote, open courseware, unquote. The license of those is not free because it does not allow commercial use. Which means anyone who wants to publish commercially a modified version may have to ask permission of a whole chain of people who non-commercially modified it. That may not even be feasible. Creative Commons was inspired by the free software movement, according to Larry Lessig. However, there is a fundamental difference between Creative Commons and the free software movement. We say, you deserve the four freedoms. It's wrong to ever take them away from you. And we are writing free software to right that wrong, to give you the ability to do your computing without any of that freedom-trampling proprietary software. So for us, it's all based on freedom that you deserve. Creative Commons does not say that users deserve any freedom. Creative Commons does not say that its mission is to establish certain freedom. What it says is that it is catering to copyright holders and offering them means to more flexibly use the copyright power that they have. I think that that decision was a terrible mistake. Despite that, the Creative Commons licenses are useful. All of them are legitimate for some uses because, as it happens, all of them are shareable licenses. So I think that all of them are okay for artistic works and entertainment works, for works that state opinions or thoughts of someone. 2 of them are free licenses, which means they're okay for works that do practical jobs. The other 4 are non-free, but they're all shareable. However, that was not always the case. When Creative Commons started, all its licenses were at least shareable for everyone. So they were all, in my view, acceptable for some kinds of works. But then Creative Commons introduced some licenses that didn't even give everybody in the world the freedom to share those works, the works under those licenses, which meant for me that they could never ethically be used. So I first complained about this privately, asking them to change, and they didn't, so I went public, and a lot of people joined in, and eventually they withdrew, they deprecated the non-shareable licenses and returned to a point where all their licenses were at least shareable licenses, and therefore, in my view, all are okay for at least some kinds of works. Speech recognition, I think, is the most important gap in free software. We need to be able to dictate. Now, I have pain all the time in this finger. It's partly related to this injury. I have, instead of an ulnar nerve, a lunar vern. That's because I had an operation called an ulnar nerve transposition. If you do a transposition on ulnar nerve, you can get lunar vern. Seriously, what the operation consisted of was moving that nerve to a different place in the hope that that would help it to heal from the damage that occurred in a previous operation on my arm. Anyway, I live with it. I have a mission in life. There was a time when it hurt so much for other reasons. That was before I broke my elbow. There was a time that both of my hands were hurting so much that I could only type a few hours a day. The FSF had to hire typists for me. And then I found a better keyboard, which made the problem go away, which is why I can now travel so much. In any case, it would be nice to have software to do dictation, but I wouldn't even consider using a non-free program. The idea of free software came to me from seeing it in life at MIT. And at first I applied it only to software. But in the 90s, as I gave speeches about free software, people started asking me to what extent these ideas applied to other things. Well, I had begun to think about one piece of that in the 80s, namely manuals for software, because a program should come with a manual. If the program is free, the manual needs to be free also, because when you redistribute the program, you should distribute the manual with it. And if you change the program, you should update the manual to correspond to accurately describe your changes in the program. Therefore, the manual must carry the same 4 freedoms also. And that was what I did always from the beginning of the GNU project, and I wrote about that in the 80s when I saw that people were starting to make non-free manuals for my free software. I said, this is not the way things should be. This is not contributing. This is leading people astray. So I began publishing this explanation of why manuals also need to be free. But I didn't try to go beyond software and manuals until people began asking me that question in the 90s. And I arrived at the conclusions that I've already stated. Now, one interesting new area, a new category of works, a new genre of works, I should say, is designs for 3D printers. Now, in some cases, these are useful parts. Their designs must be free because all the works that you use to do useful jobs in your life, practical jobs, must be free. But sometimes they are decorative works. And those, I would say, must be shareable like other artistic works. I don't know why people shy away from making statements of values, but our society seems to condemn that. Partly, I think, because of the influence of business. You're supposed to do whatever the 1% want to pay you to do. You're not supposed to have any principles. And you're certainly not supposed to condemn anything that a corporation does. Especially not if it isn't illegal. Because corporations don't have to be decent. Real persons, if they do something that's lawful but nasty, you'll say, "You're a jerk. You're acting like a jerk. Stop it." But we're not supposed to ever say that to these phony people. We're supposed to say, "Oh, well, it's lawful, so we just have to suffer it." How I learned to be able to fight back, I'm not completely sure. When I was a teenager, I didn't have it very much. I wasn't politically active, really. I wasn't part of the counterculture, but I did feel that my life at home was like living under a tyranny. When I went away to college, I felt that I had escaped. And it was a tremendous relief to be by myself. So that didn't enable me to start resisting anything. I developed that slowly over the period of years where I worked for MIT, because I joined a community that had principles of freedom, and I liked them, so I became one of the upholders of those principles of freedom. For instance, no security on the computers. I'm not the one who made that decision. The operating system had been written before I got there. But once I was hired as part of the group that developed the operating system, it was up to me, along with the others, to protect this principle. The motive for having no security in the system was to prevent administrators from controlling the users. So I also resisted efforts by administrators to take control. When some of the sister labs that were using the same operating system put passwords on their computers, I did various things as acts of resistance. For instance, one lab implemented passwords and stored the encrypted passwords, so there was no file where you could actually read people's passwords. But I looked at the code to encrypt a password and saw that I could write a program to decrypt the passwords, not with 100% certainty, but I could, with a little bit of guessing, I usually found someone's password. So then, what did I do with this? I didn't break the security. That wasn't necessary. I had an account on that computer. I could still change anything in that system I wanted to. I had no need personally to break any security. What I sought to do was something more fun than that, namely to convince other people to reject security. So I would decrypt someone's password and send that person a message saying, "I see your password is such and such. As you can see, these passwords don't provide much security, so why not do the same thing I do and put in the empty string as your password. In other words, just type return when it asks you for a password. That will support the principle that there should be no passwords. And I got 1/5 of the users on the machine to join me in using a protest password, meaning it's effectively no password at all. Because if everybody chooses the same password, it's as if there were no passwords. So I used my decryption program not to break security, but to reject security as a protest. This is what I mean by playful cleverness. So this was a hack that I'm proud of. Later, when another lab put on passwords, I found a clever way to make it print a user's password as part of the login message on the log console. So, far from keeping the passwords secret, it logged all of them. After all, if passwords are so important, they should be logged, right? Now, one of the features of the system was you could look at anybody else's console output. Anybody could look at anybody else's console output. And in particular, you could also look at the log console. You didn't have to be physically at MIT to look at it. Anyone logged in over the internet could watch what was coming out on the log console. So once again, I had found a way to completely defeat passwords. So campaigning against security was different from campaigning for free software. I didn't need to campaign for free software at that time. We still were doing free software all the time. But it gave me the strength to say no, to say stubbornly no. But what really gave me that strength was the war against Symbolics. When Symbolics, one of the two list machine companies, issued its ultimatum, and I said, no way, I'm going to make you regret that. I'm going to thwart the aims of your attack on the lab. I had to work damned hard because I had to outdo several of the people who used to be among the lab's best hackers with me. So that wasn't easy. I had to focus, concentrate, and work all day. And I did. So I got to be very, very good at saying, they will not pass. I don't remember all of our high priority projects. You should look on the site for the list. But they include a free replacement for Skype, because Skype involves using a non-free client program, and I'm pretty sure that it supports spying on you if you make the mistake of using it. And I believe also free CAD software, CAD, of course, and it means computer-aided design. And another high priority project is a free Flash player. Nowadays, I spend most of my year traveling and giving speeches to raise awareness and concern about issues of freedom in computing. For instance, why you must insist on using only free software, why we should legalize sharing all published works, why there must be no patents in the computing field, how dangerous they are and harmful, and also about other threats to our freedom. These include surveillance, because digital technology is Stalin's dream. If you're carrying a portable phone, it's saying where you are every few minutes, and that's going into a database that records the information for a long time. And thanks to the USAP at Riot Act, the FBI can collect all that information en masse uh, every few weeks. So even if they delete it after 6 months or a year or 2 years, the FBI can keep it forever, and they have a total dossier on everybody who has a portable phone, which is why I won't have one. And then there's the danger of censorship. We see filters and prohibitions placed on the internet, not just in governments that we all know are tyranny, such as China and Iran, but in countries such as France, Spain, Italy, in the UK, and it's proposed in the US as well with the Internet Blacklist Bill that's being considered now by Congress. Look at demandfreedom.org. There's also the danger to our freedom from secret data formats. They may be used to save your own data so that you can't use your own data the way you wish. They may be used for published works so that you can't use your copy the way you wish. Then there is the threat to your freedom that comes from certain network services. They can abuse your data. They can refuse to let you get your data back and use it flexibly as you choose. They can also show supposedly private data to people you don't want to get it. And in particular, the FBI can probably collect it without even showing you a search warrant. And then there's the danger that an internet service can take control of your computing. If you do your own computing in somebody else's server, you lose control over it. It's just like using a non-free program. It does the same harm. So in addition to insisting on free software and rejecting the software that would take control of your computing and give that control to somebody else, you've got to refuse to do your computing in internet services that would take control over it and give it to someone else. Another threat to our freedom comes from computerized voting. You can't trust software in an election. Even if somebody studied the source code of the program that's supposed to run in those machines during the election and verified that it's correct and it doesn't have a secret backdoor that can be used to steal the election, how do you know that the same program is running when you vote? You can't be sure. Elections are special because you can't trust anybody that's involved. So our traditional electoral systems are designed so that they don't trust anyone. No party involved is trusted to be honest, and it has to be that way. But with computers, there's always somebody who controls the program, and the rest of us are forced to trust that party. There is strong evidence that some elections in the US have been stolen through computerized voting machines. Voting must be done on paper. Another threat to our freedom comes from the war on sharing, all the nasty means that have been used to try to attack sharing. I already mentioned some. Another, of course, is the practice of putting digital handcuffs into the devices we use. And then the law that prohibits, that censors free software that can break the digital handcuffs. So that clearly showed, that law, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998, that our government was on the side of the megacorporations against its citizens. It's a traitor government. And finally, our freedom is threatened as we move activities from the physical world to the virtual world, because in the virtual world, whatever we do on sufferance. You don't have the right to have a connection to the internet. Your ISP can disconnect you because it wants to. You don't have a right to have a domain name in the internet. The U.S. government can seize your domain name without even charging you with any crime. And you don't have a right to receive money from anyone on the internet. You can only do that with the help of various companies. And those companies can disconnect your service effectively arbitrarily. So these fundamental activities, to be able to communicate your views to someone, to be able to receive money to support your activities, these are all precarious once you start doing them in the digital world.